Hi, everyone. I'm Pastor Dave. I am a pastor by virtue of my ordination through an online ministry. Anyway, I'm here to try to teach or to align myself, perhaps even pair up with progressives in the hope to create a better dialogue between progressives, especially progressive Christians, and social conservative Christians. And I think I have the way to do that. And I just want to just present this rather simple approach, and hopefully you can use it to try to point out to social conservative Christians the kind of hypocrisy they live in. It doesn't work on just non-believing social conservatives. They're just going to have their political viewpoint. But in my estimation, if you call yourself a Christian and a social conservative, you're living in some kind of cognitive conflict, because those two philosophies or points of view are in direct contradiction to each other. And so this video is to try to help people understand that distinction and to help perhaps educate social conservative Christians on how to be better Christians and kind of surrender or give up their need for a social conservative way of thinking, because it is not in direct consistency with Christian values. So when I talk about Christian values, this is what I mean. I consider Christian values those values that are identified in the New Testament and attributed to Jesus Christ. Whether you believe in the existence of Christ or not doesn't matter. For the social conservative Christian, they definitely believe in Christ, but for some reason they do not embrace these values. And this is where you should begin to recognize the kind of conflict they live in. Christ wanted us to live lives of non-judgment, where we're not to judge others for whatever sins they are or for however they look, however they speak. Non-judgment was an absolute essential element in Christian philosophy, or what Christ values. And it's important to understand not only do these values come from the New Testament, they also have a rather, progressive way or approach, in that you should attempt to live your life in non-judgment before you can attempt to live your life in forgiveness. And whenever we say non-judgment, forgiveness, love, or peace, we're talking about the dual nature of it. Not only you should not judge yourself, but also not judge others. Same with forgiveness. Don't judge yourself, and forgive yourself and then forgive others. Love yourself, love others. Live in peace with yourself and with others. And peace is really the goal. Jesus really believed it was possible to bring the heavenly kingdom on earth. And this is how he figured out how to do that. He himself had to go through these higher levels of consciousness, if you will. That was part of his spiritual development. And he felt that we could also do that too. And in fact, encourage us to do so. So those are the Christian values that Christ wanted. And you can see that they kind of line up with progressive politics. If we are really caring for everybody and we're showing compassion towards everyone to try to make their life on earth better, we have to show love, we have to have compassion, and ultimately we want these things for everyone, and that will help create a sense of peace in ourselves and around the world. So progressive politics and Christian values do line up nicely. For example, Medicare for all. It is an absolutely perfect Christian value-based policy, political perspective. It is a goal, and it is consistent with progressive Christians and non-believing progressives as well, because they want what's best for everyone. And that's why that Christian value does line up with progressive values. Whether they are believers or not, it is irrelevant. But Christians need to understand that what progressives offer politically is in alignment with their own Christian values. And I'll give you more examples, but I just want to give the Medicare for All as an example. So if a social conservative Christian is against Medicare for All, for example, it seems to be in direct conflict. And the reason why is because social conservative Christians do not have Christian values. So they do not embrace the values that Jesus wanted us to embrace for our lives. And I don't know why. Well, I have this idea why, and I'm just going to go to the next slide. This is the Old Testament values. These are the things that are important to Old Testament believers. One of the most significant is obedience. You are expected to follow the law of God. The civil law, maybe not so much, but you're supposed to still follow the law. And if you don't follow the law, like if you can't avoid sin, then you should be condemned and ultimately punished. And in the Old Testament, God is cruel. I mean, absolutely. There's a number of sins, up to 175 different sins, and many of them have the death penalty as punishment. Certainly like adultery and homosexuality, that's a big one. I once saw this list of all the sins, all listed, just one right after another. There's like 175, and all of them were in this bold black font, except for one, and it was in a bright red. And you know which one that one was? Homosexuality. I don't know, there's something eerily perverse about social conservatives' obsession with homosexuality and the amount of time they devote to it. And it really comes down to this simple thing. Not only are they uncomfortable with the sexuality of homosexuals, but they are breaking the rule. Because in the Old Testament, it clearly says that a man cannot lay with a man like a man lays with a woman. So that is the nice, clean way of saying that men can't have sex with men. But nonetheless, their obsession with it is just completely throwing them off this effort to raise their level of consciousness, because they are constantly living in condemnation. And they particularly focus on homosexuals. So the condemnation, and they want to develop civil law consistent with religious law. They would love nothing better than to have in place rules that say if you do live a life as a homosexual, you should be killed. So this is all Old Testament thinking. They want you to obey the rules of God. And if you don't, you should be condemned and punished, even to death. And that should scare the hell out of you. And that was really its purpose. I mean, in a way, the whole Torah, all of the old Jewish sacred text, what we call the Old Testament, is really designed to just keep people in line and in a state of fear. And social conservative Christians embrace this philosophy. They love fear. They live by fear. They think it's important that everyone live in fear. And that is in opposition, if I can recall, Christian values of love and peace. Those are in direct opposition with social conservative Old Testament thinking. So on any issue, if a social conservative Christian believes one thing, it's because they are living in, or their whole political perspective is rooted in Old Testament thinking. It's always based on fear. It's always based on obedience. Those are the values of the Old Testament. Jesus had a higher calling. The Old Testament you can look at as the book that reflects how we are, how human beings are. We are apparently in need of rules, because if we don't have rules, we don't know what we're going to do with ourselves. We're not capable of deriving our own morality based on just what's best for people. No, no, no. We don't have that. We don't have that consciousness, that level of thinking. We are to be forced into following rules, and you are to obey them or else be killed or punished. So fear is the driving force behind Old Testament thinking. And it is the same driving force behind all social conservative Christian political thinking. And you can pick out any political issue, guns, gun control. They don't just want Second Amendment rights. What they want is the government to get out of their life. They are afraid of their own government. And they are afraid that if the government has too much control over things in their lives, that they will ultimately take away their religion and they will not have their faith, which I find ironic because social conservative Christians don't live as Christians. They do focus on the afterlife. That's their, they want that ticket to ride for eternal salvation. That's what they're thinking. But when you're talking about living in the here and now and basing your politics based on Christian values, they are not Christian. They just clearly do not embrace the values of the New Testament. And this is where you can get them, because this is where you can point that out and say, hey, Christ wanted people or his followers to follow his Christian values of non-judgment, forgiveness, love, and ultimately to come to a level of peace. And it really takes spiritual work or psychological work or whatever neutral secular term to raise your consciousness so that you can live outside of fear. And if you are not doing that, then you're not really living as a Christian, or you're not living as a true progressive with a non-believing system. You do, for whatever reason, progressives, if they are non-believers, are still interested in what's good for humanity. There's a sense of well-being. There's a sense of understanding about how we can be better as a society. And that's definitely lines up with Christian values. So we should be in alliance. Progressive Christians and regular progressives should definitely be brothers and sisters in our effort for a unified peace on earth. That's worth pursuing. Unfortunately, social conservative Christians hold an awful lot of power in this country, and they are making things very difficult to move forward. And here I think maybe we can have a conversation with social conservative Christians to say, when you decide that Medicare for All is not a good Christian policy, or is not a political action that you want to be part of, you should ask, well, why is that? Why don't you want that? Christ wanted us to help and show compassion for everyone. He wanted us to reach out and help those in need. So why would Medicare for All be such a terrible program? And of course, they'll argue it's too expensive. It's, we're going to get taxed too much. The quality of care, all of that's going to be, it's going to suffer. And all of that is just masking, because the truth is they are just living in fear. They don't want the government to have that kind of control because they're afraid that government control equates with no religion, or they'll lose their religious rights. which is not true, but that's the problem with fear. Fear is always stifling their thinking. And it might behoove us to try to remind social conservative Christians that if they really want to act as Christians in life, then they should want to embrace things that can help other people lift themselves out of poverty or those that are in need, for whatever the reason is. Like if a hurricane comes through, the government should definitely step in and help out. And it surprises me that at times, social conservative Christians, political Christians, will absolutely be not in favor of the government stepping in to help out. And it all stems from giving government too much control equates with taking away my religion. And yet pointing out that discrepancy between their politics and their Christian values maybe might convince them that they might want to think a better way, because they give too much credit to pastors, and the pastors are trained to keep them in a state of Old Testament values. They want to keep them in a state of fear, because that's how you can control things. That's why there's such a powerful political body, because they have this sort of mission-based mentality that we are to push the faithful thinking of Old Testament thinking, even though it's in contradiction with Christian-based thinking. And again, this works for every single issue. You know, how can gun control be a problem for a Christian if they are wanting peace? Most Christians shouldn't even want guns at all. So it's not that we would want to change the Second Amendment. That's not even the point. It's like, well, we don't want to live in that because, you know, if we live by the sword or the gun, we're going to die by it. We don't want to have guns as part of our life because we want peace. And so those things are in direct contradiction. But the understanding that social conservative Christians who want guns, they don't want government control at all, because they think that somehow it's going to deny them their religious freedom, which is just fear. It's not rational, and it's our job to try to point that out. Any other issue you can think of? Immigration. I mean, that's definitely a fear-based thinking. They don't want immigrants at all, and yet the Bible is full of where Christians are to reach out to foreigners and to try to help those in need. I mean, that just should be fundamental Christian thinking. And it's much more consistent with compassion, forgiveness, with the goal of having peace on earth. These are things that will work in every single situation. And even abortion. Abortion might seem like, ooh, that's the tough issue. But remember, Old Testament thinkers only think of the fact that abortion is against the commandment of thou shalt not kill. This is the only tie here. If you're not supposed, they have no problem killing people who violate the law. That's perfectly fine, because God said if you break the law, you get killed. So they have no problem imposing the death penalty and doing all this, because that's the rule. So their perspective is, hey, you can't kill the unborn child because that's against the commandment that says thou shalt not kill. And that's a rule breaker. So if you're not in obedience of that rule, then you should be punished. And be sure that if they ever get their way, mothers and everybody will potentially be killed. They will reinstitute, or they'll institute the death penalty for anyone who has killed an unborn baby. Now you think, wow, a lot of Christians, progressive Christians, might have a problem with this issue, but you shouldn't have a problem, because you think more pro-life. You're not just anti-abortion, you're pro-lifer, meaning that your interest in the baby is not exclusive. It's not just about the baby, it's about the mother. And it's also about the baby when the baby becomes a newborn baby. So you can see that your definition of pro-life is expanded because you want to know what's best for the mother, what's best for the unborn child, and what's best for the newborn. And social conservative Christians have no tolerance of creating any kind of support for either the mother or the newborn baby. And so they are absolutely creating the environment to make abortion a viable choice. If social conservative Christians really didn't want babies aborted, then they would be more loving, more compassionate, more forgiving. They would absolutely try to provide whatever support they can give the mother and the newborn baby, so that you can encourage the mother to keep the baby, but don't guilt them in. Don't make it about fear. Don't make it about condemnation and God's wrath on you if you decide to kill your baby. That's just not going to work, and it's not the Christian way. Abortion is not about love, and it's not about forgiveness, and it's not Christian to just be anti-abortionist and forget about the life of the mother and the life of the newborn baby. So you should be embracing Medicare for all to make sure that everyone has the proper medical care so that mother doesn't have to worry about her unborn baby, and for the newborn baby, once it's born, those things should be absolutely part of your thinking. You should absolutely reach out and make sure that mother has proper education or a job, a place to live, whatever it is that they need. So you can turn a pro-life position into an expanded idea, or an anti-abortion position into a pro-life position where you include the life of everyone. And of course, if you are pro-life, you should also be against the death penalty. So you should be in favor of justice reform, criminal justice reform, because you want people to be forgiven. You want people to raise their consciousness enough so that they can improve themselves. This is why this works. Every single progressive issue can be supported by Christian value-based thinking. And it cannot be supported by social Christian or social conservative Christian Old Testament thinking. And that's what we have here. We have this need to reach out. We have an opportunity to use this sort of simple distinction between Old and New Testament values to clarify why social conservatives believe what they do, and if they are Christian, why they should continue to believe that way. Because they should be on the side of progressive thinking. Jesus was clearly a progressive character, whether you believe he was real or not. They attribute him as a brave, wanting big change, and he prescribed exactly how to go about the change, just as a reminder. Through non-judgment, again, these are progressive hierarchy of consciousness. You learn to stop judging yourself and others so that you can learn to forgive yourself and others, so that you can learn to love each other and yourself, and so that you can live in peace with yourself and with others. That's the stairway to heaven, if you will. We want that kind of progressive thinking, even if you're not a believer in Christ. It doesn't matter. You can make a difference by trying to convince them that being more pro-life is true for everything. Being an advocate of climate change, understanding the necessity that we change our fossil fuel system is definitely rooted in Christian values, because it's a pro-life value. You want what's best for this earth. We're supposed to have dominion over this earth. We're supposed to take care of the earth, that kind of stuff. That's a biblical principle. So it's certainly consistent with what Christ wanted us. He wanted us to be in favor to create peace on Earth. And one of the things we can do is to address the climate change issue. And that is totally consistent with Christian value thinking. And the reason why it's not consistent with social conservative Christian values is because the only reason why they don't want to address the climate change is because of fear, because it's going to cost too much money. It's going to provide too much government control, and they're going to take away my religion. So all of this narrow fear-based thinking is what's killing our political system. And it goes for every single issue. Trust me, just try to apply it to any issue and you can be convincing. And hopefully bring social conservative Christians over to the side of Christian value-based living, or at least recognize that there is a problem with their thinking. So I'm hoping this is helpful. Please subscribe, like, share. It helps me get the ministry out there. So I appreciate your time, and I'm going to call it over because I think I've made my point, perhaps even too much.